Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dario Health. Manage your blood glucose levels, increase your possibilities. By Gvoke HypoPen, the first pre-mixed auto-injector for very low blood sugar. And by Dexcom. Take control of your diabetes and live life to the fullest with Dexcom.
This is Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
This week, Jack Tierney is 81 years old and was diagnosed with diabetes more than 60 years ago. He had classic symptoms, but remembers being shocked to hear the news.
And he told me I was a diabetic, and I said to him, "What's that?" I had never heard the word or knew nothing about it, and he told me what it was, generally speaking, and I'm convinced that the doctor probably did not know the difference between type 1 and type 2 because this was January of 1960.
Jack was misdiagnosed with type 2 for almost 2 years. He shares the story of finally getting the right diagnosis, living well with T1D before home blood sugar meters or fast-acting insulins, and why he just last year switched to a pump at age 80. In Tell Me Something Good. Boy, it was great to get back out to an actual in-person diabetes conference. Shout out not just to Friends for Life, but to my local Charlotte community as well. This podcast is not intended as medical advice. If you have those kinds of questions, please contact your healthcare provider. Welcome to another week of the show. Always so glad to have you here. We aim to educate and inspire about diabetes with a focus on people who use insulin. My son Benny was diagnosed 14 and a half years ago, just before he turned 2. My husband lives with type 2 diabetes. I don't have diabetes, but I have a background in broadcasting, and that is how you get the podcast. I got an email a couple of weeks ago from Jack Tierney, who you'll hear from today, and he said, check out the 12-minute YouTube video that my son, an LA filmmaker, has created for me. It's called An 81-Year-Old's 62-Year Journey with Type 1 Diabetes. Well, that got my attention. I've talked to quite a few people over the years who have lived a very long time with type 1. It really is incredible to think about how they made it work without the things that we consider now like the very, very basics, right? Home blood sugar meters, an A1C test, fast-acting insulins. Jack and his son Jamie have a great story, and I will link up that video that started all of this in the show notes. You can always go to diabetes-connections.com. If you're listening on a podcast player, like Apple or Spotify or Pandora, sometimes the show notes are a little wonky and the links don't work. Just head over to the episode homepage. And it also has a transcription. If you follow me on social, you know that I went to the Friends for Life conference recently, the first in-person conference for me since March of 2020. I'm going to talk about that after the interview, but I wanted to say a quick welcome to anybody new who is listening, who found me there, who I met at that conference. There were so many new people. It was great to be able to say hi and have some hugs and meet your kids. So I'll talk about that a little bit. And I'll get to Jack's story in just a moment. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dario Health. And, we first noticed Dario a couple of years ago at a conference. And Benny thought being able to turn your smartphone into a meter was pretty amazing. I'm excited to tell you that Dario offers even more now. The Dario Diabetes Success Plan gives you all the supplies and support you need to succeed. You'll get a glucometer that fits in your pocket, unlimited test strips and lancets delivered to your door, and a mobile app with a complete view of your data. The plan is tailored for you with coaching when and how you need it and personalized reports based on your activity. Find out more. Go to mydario.com/diabetes-connections. Well, Jack and Jamie, thank you so much for joining me. I am so interested to hear this story. Thanks for making time for me today.
Oh, you're welcome.
We will hear Jack's story, and I can't wait to hear you in your own words. But Jamie, let me just start with you. What made you create that video?
My dad said he was working on some scripts about his thoughts on diabetes and living with it for, over 60 years. He wrote a number of different stories about it and wanted to record that on camera. And so we started doing that, and we have all 8 tapes, I believe, of doing that. But what I was most interested in is his personal story, his life story, because once we got started, there was a lot of things that I didn't know about his story and about diabetes in general. And so that's what got me interested. And then I wanted to follow up with his doctor and with his brother to get multiple sides, and also with my mom too, to get her side of it. It's one of those things that it started off as one thing and changed a little bit as we went.
All right. So, Jack, you have lived 62 years with type 1. Can you talk about your diagnosis? Because not too surprisingly, you weren't diagnosed correctly right away.
Right, yeah. In the first tape that I did with Jamie, I did talk about what happened with me. I actually came down with type 1 in 1959. At the time, my mother, who was only 43, had a brain tumor, and I was under a lot of stress. And I was attending college. In fact, when I was home with her after she had a tumor removed, I did get the flu. Like so many type 1s, it just exacerbated or caused type 1 diabetes because I weighed 100. I'm 6'4" at the time. I weighed 150 pounds. I was down to 125.
Wow.
And peeing incessantly like everyone who gets type 1 does. And so I returned to college. What happened was I was just deteriorating so fast. I was in a small town in Indiana attending college. So I went to the local general practitioner, and he did some tests and told me my blood sugar was over 500 and it needed to be 80 to 120. And he told me I was a diabetic. And I said to him, "What's that?" I had never heard the word or knew nothing about it. He told me what it was, generally speaking. And I'm convinced that the doctor probably did not know the difference between type 1 and type 2 because this was January of 1960, and he was a general practitioner in a very small town. But what he did do was consult with the dietitian at the college I was attending, and he treated me, I now know, pretty much like a type 2 diabetic because he put me on a 1,000-calorie diet. Here I am weighing 125 and surviving on, and he did give me a pill. I believe it was called diabinase. I really survived that way for about 18 months, just living on a 1,000-calorie diet. And I was in a really rigorous academic program, too. But then, as my brother indicates on the video, I came home, and he was really worried about me. And luckily, I had transferred to the University of Dayton, and I got in touch with a wonderful doctor who put me on insulin shots. And that made all the difference in the world. I did get back to weighing about 150 in about 6 months and, took to taking shots. In fact, what I say on the video, when I add it all up, I've given myself probably 42,000 shots over the years. By the way, preparing to do the tapes, Jamie, because whenever Jamie does a film project, he does extensive background for it. And he gave me a book titled Breakthrough about the discovery of insulin by Dr. Frederick Banning. And in fact, I'm going to start to cry here because I read that book in 2 days. Because it just reminded me of how many kids died before Dr. Banning, who's one of the greatest human beings that ever lived, discovered insulin. And it just brought back so much to me reading that book. But the man was an absolute saint for all that he did. And I'm sorry for crying, but every time I think of that man, I just think all of us who are type 1s are eternally grateful to him. In fact, he's got to have one of the highest places in heaven.
It is incredible, as we're marking 100 years of the discovery of insulin, to think that someone such as yourself was diagnosed at a time really not that long after, at a time when many doctors, and they still mess this up, but didn't know the differences between the types. I'm curious, I've heard other people talk about being diagnosed in the 40s and 50s by medical professionals who kind of, gave them really dire diagnosis or dire outcomes, or would say, you're really not going to live that long. Were you, I hear the emotion in your voice. Were you told things like that back then?
No, that's very interesting because I remember, for example, one of the doctors that I know just casually here in San Diego is Dr. Steve Edelman, and he too is a type 1 diabetic. And I remember in a paper he had written, he mentioned the fact that he was told that he would live no more than 15 years. And he was diagnosed as a young adolescent. So I know that many people who were afflicted with type 1 were told, for example, one of my doctors has put me in touch with 2 or 3 other type 1 diabetics here in San Diego who've had it for 60 years. And one of the women that I talked to, she's now 70, and she was diagnosed at age 13. And again, the doctors told her that she would live no more than 15 years.
Jeez. How did you then go forward? I mean, it sounds like you kind of alluded to that, I did the shots. It wasn't that difficult. I gained the weight back. But this was at a time before blood sugar meters. This was at a time where I assume if you were checking, it wasn't very accurate. What were you doing? Right back to Jack answering that question. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Gvoke HypoPen. And our endo always told us if you use insulin, you need to have emergency glucagon on hand as well. Low blood sugars are one thing. We're usually able to treat those with fast-acting glucose tabs or juice. But a very low blood sugar can be very frightening, which is why I'm so glad there's a different option for emergency glucagon. It's Gvoke HypoPen. Gvoke HypoPen is pre-mixed and ready to go with no visible needle. You pull off the red cap and push the yellow end onto bare skin and hold it for 5 seconds. That's it. Find out more. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Gvoke logo. Gvoke shouldn't be used in patients with pheochromocytoma or insulinoma. Visit gvokeglucagon.com/risk. Now back to Jack answering my question about how he stayed healthy.
Well, I'll tell you, one of the tapes that I did with Jamie was on exercise. I quickly realized how important exercise was. I just felt intuitively that I would utilize insulin more effectively via exercise. And so, as I mentioned on the tape, one day when I was 23 years old, I played 50 holes of golf carrying my own bag. And I used to routinely play basketball because I'm 6'4", 3 to 4 hours, sometimes even 5 or 6 at a time, if I had the opportunity away from my academic studies. So I just found that exercise was so important. And, I've been somewhat of an exercise buff all my life. In fact, one reason why I contacted you and Diabetics Connections, because on a news release here in San Diego, I saw where Eric Tozer was running 8 different marathons in every continent in the U.S. over a short period of time.
Yeah.
And he's a type 1 diabetic. So, in fact, on one of the tapes, I say whenever I get wind of people like Eric, I really follow their story because it's motivational to me to maintain the exercise level that I like to.
Let me jump over to Jamie for a minute. As you're hearing your dad talk about, playing 50 holes of golf and basketball, growing up, was he super active? Was this a family thing? Did he make you all get involved, or was this his thing?
Oh, no. I've been playing golf with my dad since before I can remember. I think since I was about 2 years old. And, I was thinking because the U.S. Open was finishing yesterday, and he used to wake up at 3 a.m. and drive down there and get us a place in line to go play, and then come home and wake me up and take me back there, and then we play golf, and then he'd come back and do yard work and stuff like that. So, and growing up, I never thought of him as any different than anybody else's dad. Probably quite a bit more active than most other dads I knew around. So,
was diabetes kind of in the background then? Do you remember as a kid or, as a young adult at all? I'm trying to envision what it would be like, because now, with insulin pumps, with CGMs, we see it more. But I'm curious, Jamie, from your perspective, what it was like to grow up with a dad with type 1.
Well, I'd always see him do the shots, and, I don't remember ever asking him what those were about, but I just remember always knew what it was, that he had to take medicine. He had to do it every single day and had to do it with the needle, which isn't fun for anybody. I remember a few times, when we'd be out playing golf, especially if it was hot, that he'd bring like a candy bar with him. And in case he would start feeling a little woozy, he would eat something to kind of revive himself. There was a couple times I remember when it got a little bit scarier than that, where he needed some assistance. He needed to get back to the clubhouse quickly to get back to normal. So I was always aware of that. But again, I didn't really know that much about the disease itself and how it works, other than if he's ever looking a little bit off, that he needs to get some carbohydrates in him quickly.
Jack, I would imagine, and I'm just thinking from my own experience as a parent and as a daughter,
Sure.
Our parents generally don't want us taking care of them. And we don't want our kids taking care of us when we become parents. But type 1 diabetes is kind of always there. Were you consciously trying to think, okay, I don't want Jamie to have this responsibility. I've got this. Did that kind of stuff go through your mind?
No, I just felt, it's an affliction. Everybody has ailments and afflictions. And, once I realized how valuable and important for my health taking shots were, it just became second nature to me. And I just felt so much better. But I just told my wife last night, since I've been on the T-Slim X2 in the last 8 months, I've never felt better in my life, and I'm 81 years old. So I just am seeing the value of the pump, And like Dr. McCallum says on the tape, he was a little surprised that I would take to it. But, I always, I respect him so much. He just told me that this T-Slim is really something. And I'm just so thankful I took the leap 8 months ago and did it, because I feel tremendous having done it. I do feel better now that I'm on the pump than I ever did just taking shots.
Wow. What led you to do this? Was it a conversation with your endocrinologist?
Yes, and just also, he told me that this pump was exceptional in his point of view. In fact, Stacey, I'll say this to you. I just, and it's a long story, but I did talk with Dr. Aaron Kowalski today, the president of JDRF in New York, and he told me he's using the T-Slim, the Tandem T-Slim X2 also. So that made me feel really good that maybe this is definitely, it just reinforced my decision as being a very good one, hearing about this from Dr. Kowalski.
Well, I'm no Dr. Kowalski, but we chose it too. And I got to tell you, I absolutely love it for my son. It's just, the software is incredible.
Great.
Oh, it's great. So you were already then using a Dexcom CGM, because if you're listening and not familiar, the Tandem system works with the Dexcom.
Right.
Are you using that together, and had you been using a CGM for a while?
Yes. In fact, that's a funny story. You're going to love this story. What happened was about 3 years ago, I went to see Dr. McCallum, and I wanted to get on a continuous glucose monitor because, I'd seen it advertised and it just sounded like the cat's meow. So I'm waiting to see him, and there's a young man waiting to see another endocrinologist. And he says, Dr. Tierney. And I said, what? And what it was a young man whose first name is Brendan. And I saw Brendan when he was 9 years old to help him get ready for a test to get into a highly academic private school here in San Diego. And at the time, he told me he was a type 1 diabetic. And so what happened was he was using the Librem and went over all of the advantages to the Librem before I saw Dr. McCallum. So I walked into Dr. McCallum's office and I said, well, Dr. McCallum, I think I've made a decision on the continuous glucose monitor that I should be using because one of my former students told me the benefits of it.
Wow.
So I went on the Librem, but then, in fact, at the time that I went on the Librem, the Dexcom 6 wasn't available.
Right.
And so it just sounded like the best one for me at the time. But then, of course, 8 months ago, when I made the decision to go on the T-Slim, they told me it was worked in concert with the Dexcom 6, and that's why, of course, I switched to that. And it's great, too.
Yeah, it's wonderful to have these choices. I was going to ask you, right? I was going to kind of ask you to take us through the process of going from, no whole blood sugar meter to kind of, what it was like in the 80s and then, the different insulins. But you rocketed ahead and now you're on a hybrid closed loop system. So
right.
It's wild.
As I said, there was nothing available. Thinking back, I did a lot of research before I did the 8 tapes that Jamie did.
Sure.
And one of the things that I learned, and I had read a little bit about that because I read a lot, about that diabetic compilations and control study that was done in the 1980s and early 1990s with type 1s. And, in fact, they abbreviated the study early because it showed that tight control of type 1, your blood sugar is imperative. In fact, I think, in my research for those tapes, that study, I think it was called the DCC, Diabetic Complications and Control Trials, DCCT. And that thing, it was concluded early because it showed how important it was. And I think as a result of that, the A1C was developed and also Humalog, because before that, I was using NPH insulin from 1961 until the latter part of 1990s.
Wow.
When Humalog became available. And also, I got my first A1C back in the 1990s.
Wow. Because
that wasn't available until, after that monumental study, the DCCT. That's when the A1C came about, I believe, and also more synthetic insulins like Humalog.
Right.
And that helped me a lot, getting on Humalog. It really did. But I didn't get on that till about, I think, 1998, 1999, thanks to Dr. McCallum.
What does he say to you? It must be really interesting for him to talk to someone. I mean, my guess is that you educate him about many, many things as well. I'm curious. It just sounds like he's really open-minded and really a team player with you to encourage someone who has, not been on an insulin pump, who's lived with type 1 for more than 60 years, and then to make that change. Do you feel like maybe you're educating him as well?
Oh, yeah, I think it's mutual, definitely. In fact, what happened was Jamie said to me in mid-March, he said, "Dad, I'd like to interview Dr. McCallum." Mm. We've done the 8 tapes, but like Jamie just said previously, I'd like to interview Dr. McCallum. So I called him, and Jamie had to come down here on another job to San Diego from L.A., and he wanted to do it on a Friday afternoon. Well, I called Dr. McCallum, and he said, I can't do it. It's just chaotic. Why don't you guys come in Saturday morning? I couldn't believe he invited us in Saturday morning. We were the only one over there. And so I said to him, well, can I sit in and listen? Because Jamie interviewed him for an hour and a half, and I was just taking in his responses to all the questions. Because, a lot of what he presented, I had not heard before. And so it was just a very good education on my part to hear his responses to Jamie's questions. And also, all along, he's been very respectful of what I've learned. I'll give you one good example. And this is good to know for every type 1 diabetic. Sure, you've got to pay attention to your endocrinologist, but also you've got to pay attention to your experience. I remember when I first got on insulin back in the early 1960s that I was obsessive compulsive about making sure it was refrigerated. Mm. I mean, I was OCD on it. I really was. Well, I'm reading a Life magazine, and this had to be like 1963, about a gentleman by the name of Franklin Billy Talbot. And Billy Talbot was one of the greatest tennis players ever. He was diagnosed in 1929. He lived to be 80 years old. In fact, that's one reason why I made the tapes. I said, well, Billy made it to 80. Maybe my time is coming up, so I better do something that I've been contemplating doing for a while. But in that article back in the 60s, this is what Billy said. I'm playing tennis all over the world. I can't keep my insulin refrigerated all the time. And so I wasn't as, again, you kind of learn by experience what you can do and the like. I mean, sure, you take the advice of all of your doctors, but after that, I wasn't obsessive compulsive about keeping my insulin refrigerated when I learned what Billy Talbert's experience was. And that's what I found with Dr. McCallum. He really paid attention to my experiences with this chronic ailment.
That's great. Jamie, let me ask you, you are a filmmaker. What do you hope happens with this video? I could ask you why you made it. I kind of have, there's so many reasons why you would do something like this, but I'm curious, why did you do it?
Well, I mean, my dad asked me to, maybe not make exactly a film like this, but I just think it's an interesting story. I mean, when I got into it, I mean, the thing that kind of hit me, the first thing that he survived for almost 2 years without insulin.
Yeah.
I don't know how that happened, to be honest. And I tried to do some research, and I did ask the doctor how many people have ever made it for that long. I don't think there's too many that have. Forget about that he's my dad, but just from a human interest perspective, that someone could survive like that on a small amount of calories and no insulin, with basically the pancreas not producing any more insulin at all. So that I feel like is pretty interesting, just the triumph of the human spirit, I think. And then having lived for, 60 more years after that episode. But then also what's interesting to me is just how he's gone through every single phase of treatment. I know the first treatments began in the 20s, but it sounds to me like in the 60s when he first started, it was basically a similar treatment to the 20s. So he's pretty much gone through every single medical advance. And I just wonder again how many people are out there who are 81, who are getting started on something technologically advanced like this pump and taking to it. I feel like there's an interesting story there too. I don't know how many people are in his boat with that too.
Yeah.
Can I piggyback on that a little bit? I'm going to tell you something I haven't told too many people. As we said earlier, Jamie did 8 scripts. Well, everything led to script number 8. And in script number 8, what happened was from 1992 to 1995, I was asked to be superintendent of the schools in a school district that was the worst in the state out of 1,000. And when that 3-year period finished, I believe, and maybe I don't think I'm off on this, it became the best school district in the state. And Jamie was getting his master's degree at USC in screenwriting, and he said to me, "Dad, someday you have to tell this story." And I thought that was commendable on his part. In fact, he bought me a recorder. And so for a whole year, whenever I was driving in my new assignment anywhere, which involved a lot of teacher training, I would record my thoughts. And when I finished, I recorded 55 hours of material.
Wow.
And I vowed to write 3 books. And I have written those 3 books on my experience there. And that is my ultimate reason for doing these tapes with Jamie helping me, because I want to get a little bit of personal notoriety out there in hopes that a reputable publisher will publish my 3 books, because I think I've got a story. In fact, I told my wife and I just finished watching Downton Abbey because many of our friends thought it was so good. Well, I said to myself after I watched Downton Abbey, my 3 books are an American Downton Abbey, because it's a story that, in fact, when I was contemplating when I started writing the 3 books, a fellow superintendent friend of mine said, "Jack Tierney," he said, "you beat me to it. When I retired, I was going to write a Michener-like novel titled School District, because what really goes on behind the scenes in a school district has never been told. And what goes on in a border town, the story of what really goes on in a border town has not really been told yet." And that is my ultimate person. I want these books, hopefully a reputable publisher rather than my working on self-publishing, and maybe even 3 movies be made, because I think it has the potential for that. And every cent made will go to find a cure for type 1 diabetes.
Oh, that's great. Well, as we start to wrap this up, I'm curious to ask, we on this podcast hear from a lot of adults who've been diagnosed with type 1. I mean, sure, there's a lot of children as well, but this audience is really half and half. And I'm curious, what would you say? What would you say to somebody, who's 60 or 50, who's not 6 years old? What would you talk about or tell somebody who's diagnosed as an adult?
Well, I probably would say the same thing that I would say to someone who's diagnosed like those 4 young men that I saw for SAT prep. One of them was diagnosed at age 3. The other 2 were diagnosed at age 7. And then Brendan, who I mentioned earlier, 9. They have the ability and the courage to take this head on. It is a chronic ailment, but with taking the advice of your endocrinologist and working at it, it is indeed manageable. I'll tell you what one of the 4 young men told me. When I met him for the first time, we finished the session on SAT prep, and I knew in advance that he was a type 1 diabetic. He actually had been diagnosed when he was 7, and he was now 16. And I said to him, well, probably in your lifetime, there will be a cure. And you know what he said to me? You're not going to believe what he said to me, Stacey.
What did he say?
He said, I wouldn't take it.
Huh.
Because he had learned how to do it, and he had met this challenge. In fact, when he said that to me, I said, Jamie knows I've said this a lot. I think a lot of young people today, we don't have fixed rites of passage in society too much anymore, where you did something notable and the whole community recognized you as a aspiring adult. So young people are picking their own ways to prove to themselves, the world, and their families that they can stand on their own 2 feet. So I think that's why that young man because he had his rite of passage thrust upon him, and he felt that he had successfully done it, and so he didn't want it taken away necessarily.
Yeah.
Anyhow, that's my degree in philosophy kind of coming to the fore here on why he responded the way he did.
I've heard my dad tell versions of the story my whole life, but it's nice to have something that you can condense into 11 minutes, and hopefully that people can get a sense of him, but also just how you can thrive and have a great life amidst the challenge of this disease. And as he says, that hopefully this treatment is great, but hopefully there is a cure someday. And stories like harrowing stories of what my dad went through isn't something that the future has to deal with.
Jack, are you still playing golf?
Oh, yeah.
All right.
Oh, yeah. I don't play that well, but I love to play. And what's best of all, I love playing with Jamie and his sister. In fact, every time we play, they're a lot better than I am. And they always give me a good tip, and it helps me to play a tad bit better. It's one of my neatest experiences as a father. In fact, the three of us always played on Father's Day. We don't now because Emily's in Cape Cod being a doctor, and Jamie's in L.A. But whenever we did, when they were in elementary school and high school, it was one of my fondest memories on Father's Day.
Well, thank you so much for sharing your story, Jamie and Jack. I can't thank you both.
Well, and give your best to your son, your 16-year-old son. Just neat. He's doing so well, and what a champion he is.
Thank you very much. That means so much. And I appreciate you both coming on to share your story. And, we can all learn so much from it. So thanks, guys. I really appreciate it.
You're listening to Diabetes Connections with Stacey Simms.
More information about Jack and Jamie at diabetes-connections.com, including the video with lots and lots of photos, family photos, if you'd like to take a look at that. I really appreciate them coming on So much fun to hear that story and really reflect back. And I love that he started using an insulin pump just last year. I have a friend who was diagnosed with type 1 in her late 60s and immediately went out and got the technology. She wanted a CGM right away. Hasn't started using an insulin pump yet, and she may never, and that's okay. But just knowing that the option is there, I think it doesn't matter what age, right? It's all about finding what works for you. And if you're interested in learning more about people who have lived a long time with type 1, like I said at the very beginning of the show, I've talked to several people who've lived, 60 or even 75 years with type 1. Richard Vaughn comes to mind, but there are a couple of other people who've been on the show before. And I'll try to link that up in the show notes as well and kind of make a little list if you'd like to go back if you're new to the show and want to hear more from these incredible pioneers in our community. A little bit more about in-person connections and things like that. But first, Diabetes Connections is brought to you by Dexcom. And, a couple of weeks ago, we were watching TV and I got a Dexcom alert. Benny was upstairs in his room. We were downstairs. And for some reason, it kind of took my brain back to the days when we basically had blood sugar checks on a timer. We would check doing a finger stick the same times every day at home and at school, whatever extra we needed to as well. But it's amazing to think about how much our diabetes management has changed with Share and Follow. I didn't have to stop the show to get up and check on him. I knew what was going on. I could decide whether I wanted to text him or, go upstairs and help him out. Using Share and Follow apps have really helped us talk less about diabetes, which I never thought would happen with a teenager. Trust me, he loves that part too. And that's what's so great about the Dexcom system. I think for the caregiver or the spouse or the friend, you can help the person with diabetes manage in the way that works for, their individual situation. Internet connectivity is required to access Dexcom Follow. Separate Follow app required. Learn more. Go to diabetes-connections.com and click on the Dexcom logo. So Tell Me Something Good is usually where I share your good news. And hey, send me your stuff, Stacey at diabetes-connections.com, or I'll post in the Facebook group, Diabetes Connections, the group. I'd love to hear the good things that are going on for you, this summer. And as we head into August, let me know what's going on. But for me, the Tell Me Something Good this month was Friends for Life. I didn't even realize how much I needed that until I was there. If you're not familiar, and I know many of you are joining me because you met me at that conference, but if you're not familiar, it is the largest diabetes conference in the country. This year they made a joke. It's the largest one on the planet because it's like one of the only ones happening on Earth this year. Usually it's almost 3,000 people meeting up in Walt Disney World at the convention center there. It's so hot in Orlando in July, but it's always so worth it. This year, I think it was about a third. I want to say maybe 1,000 people were there. It was a smaller event, but it was still fantastic. Speakers, education, a chance to meet the industry people, touch insulin pumps, talk to vendors, things like that. There's a lot of stuff happening. And for the kids, it's a chance to see, and adults too, it's a chance to see lots of other people wearing the technology that many feel self-conscious about. And usually by the end of the week, and I met a family like this, a shy 7-year-old who didn't want to meet anybody and was almost hiding in her hotel room, was jumping in the pool by the end of the conference, showing off her Dexcom and her insulin pump. So it's about empowering people with diabetes. It's about educating families. It's about support. As I mentioned last time we had an episode, I was going to say last week, but it was 2 weeks ago. I mentioned a new presentation that I was doing, Reframe Your Diabetes Parent Brain. I thought that went really well. I was really thrilled with the crowd, really terrific people. And they did the presentation. I was, always afraid, are people going to play along and give me their examples? But everybody was great. So if you are interested, I'll do this on Zoom. I'll come to your group. I'll come to your parent meetup. It doesn't have to be anything formal. It's really just about taking the terrible things we say to ourselves. I'm failing my child. I'm the worst mom. I'm not doing as well as everybody else. How could I possibly have forgotten the blah, blah, blah? And reframing those thoughts to help us not only feel better. This isn't like a woo-woo thing, although there's nothing wrong with changing the way you feel. But this is really actionable stuff about seeing how you are actually living so well with diabetes and you're doing a great job and your child is thriving right under your nose when sometimes you think everything is going wrong. So that was really fun. Sometimes at Friends for Life or at the ADA conference a couple of weeks ago, sometimes there's big announcements about new technology or people will do presentations and show the new stuff. There really isn't anything like that this year. There's a lot of delays because of COVID. As you know, if you listen, we are waiting for Omnipod 5 with Horizon. We are waiting for Tandem's Bolus by phone. We are waiting for Dexcom to be submitted, to submit G7 to the FDA. So there's a lot of things we're waiting on. But the community is always there. And I really, really needed to see those other moms, to hang out with everybody, and just to breathe that air again. So thank you so much for everybody who came, who said hi, and who's listening now. We also had a really, really great meetup in the Charlotte area. And I only share this because you can do this where you live. Even if you don't know anybody with diabetes, reach out to your local JDRF or post in some of these Facebook groups. Post in the Diabetes Connections group. You never know. Maybe there's somebody who's local to you. And start talking about, let's get together. We had a fantastic meetup. It was parents and kids, and it was adults with type 1. Our chapter has really gotten on the ball with adults. They have a whole volunteer outreach now for them. And, it's so cool to see people of all ages living well with diabetes. And we all help each other, right? So I share that not just to say, isn't my chapter great, which it is. Shout out to my fabulous friend, Ann Sutton, who makes that chapter hum. But also just to spur you on to think about meetups in your own area. They're hard to organize. I do them too. And it's sometimes 20 people come, sometimes 2 people come. But it is really worth it to keep putting it out there and keep trying to find parents, kids, adults in your area. We need our diabetes community. You only see your doctor for, teeny weeny amounts of time every couple of months. Diabetes is 24/7. So reach out, find people, post in the Diabetes Connections Facebook group. If you have questions, we can help you. I do a whole presentation on making connections. So I can definitely give you tips and tricks, especially as we get closer to school starting, about how to find other families in your area. All right, before I let you go, if you have listened for this long, as you are listening to this episode, if you listen as it goes live, Benny, knock on wood, should be coming home from Israel today. As I am taping, it's still a couple of days away, but it will have been a month, and I should be picking him up at the airport as this episode is airing. I am hoping that after he sleeps and showers, if he sleeps for a couple of days, that he will do a debriefing on the show and talk to me about what it was like, not just going to Israel with camp for a month, but what it was like doing all the diabetes stuff completely on his own. At this point, I don't really know a lot. I've seen his numbers, and I think I know what's going on, but I really want to hear it from him. So a couple of days left. I can do it. Keep breathing. Oh my gosh, this has been so stressful. And I will share more with you all, warts and all. I'll share the honest story, but not until he's back and home safe. All right. Thank you so much to my editor, John Buchanan from Audio Editing Solutions. Thank you so much for listening. In the News every Wednesday live on Facebook at 4:30. And then we turn that around into a Friday podcast episode. Do not miss out. In the News is like 6 or 7 minutes. It's real quick. I'm trying to get it to 5 minutes, but I can't get it to 5 minutes. It's always 6 or 7 minutes long. There's just so much good stuff happening and news to bring you from the diabetes community. So join me every Wednesday live for that, or listen for the episode here. I will see you back here in just a couple of days. Until then, be kind to yourself.
Diabetes Connections is a production of Stacey Simms Media. All rights reserved, all wrongs avenged.